The piped or besom pocket and the piped bound buttonhole are two lovely details that you can use on any kind of garment. The piped or besom pocket has, this is called a facing. That means that's so that you don't have to see the lining fabric. There's the pocket bag, and the facing goes down a little ways. This is what it looks like from the front, and this is what it looks like from the back. Then the piped buttonhole looks like this from the front, and then I'm also going to show you how to finish the facing so that you can have a working buttonhole when it's all done. This is quite a lot of work, so let's get busy. Now, before we do the deep dive into making these two techniques, I'm going to insert a little section on making piping, because I'm going to be referencing some of the terms from making piping. So I think it is instructive that you see the tutorial on piping before we continue with this. Making a piped edge is not as difficult as it looks. One of the hallmarks of a piped edge is an even thickness all along the seam and no visible stitching between the ground fabric and the piping. That's what this lesson will be covering. We have a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. Part of the success of this project is using what I call the proper fill. Now these three here, these are examples of the fills that I like to use. These two here, the white is rat tail, the gold is mouse tail. Rat tail is 3 millimeters wide, mouse tail is 2 millimeters. They're pretty much the same kind of cord. What I like about these is that the cord is rigid. It doesn't smash down, it's not terribly spongy. And so you can really get a nice smooth surface. This also has a smooth surface. Now on the smooth surface, if you're using something like a charmeuse, any other kind of fill is going to it's going to read through the fabric. The texture will read through. This has a nice smooth surface, so you are assured of an even thickness all along, and you are assured of a flat surface all along. And this here, this is what's called shoelace. Shoelace comes in a variety of diameters. It's a bias cover over a core. Again, it's not too spongy, so it makes a very firm result in the final product. You don't need a lot of fancy tools for this, but what I like is this is a generic adjustable zipper foot. This is the 1/4 inch wide. I think it's the best. Now, the reason I like this is that you turn the screw and you can adjust the foot to one side or the other of the needle, and you can adjust the foot so that the needle is either close in or right at the edge. You'll see this a little more as we go along. But this particular foot, this is on an adapter for Bernina. It's a generic foot. You can get it for most machines. So, generic adjustable zipper foot, something you want to have. For the piping, I'm going to be using rat tail, and so we're assuming a 5/8 of an inch seam, so the strips will be 1¼ to 1½ inches. I'm just going to say 1 3/8 just to split the difference. There we have our bias strips. Once you've cut your bias strips, You want to press them to relax the bias. And from here, we'll go to the machine to fill the piping. Before filling the piping, we want to adjust the foot so that the needle is as close into the little notch as possible, the zipper foot in position number 1. I tend to like using the left side of the foot to fill piping. Some people like to use the right side, but either way, the needle is as close to the inside of that curve as you can get. Now your stitch length for filling the piping is going to be 4 to 5. You don't need a short stitch here, you just need to hold it together. Next, we lay the fill, the rat tail, on the wrong side of the fabric, and we fold. We come in here, and sometimes if you want to put a pin in there, you can. Then we lower the foot. Now, the beauty of the rat tail is that it's a rigid cord, so you can really put the edge of the foot right up next to the cord. You don't have to worry about the foot running over the cord. So you're going to get an even thickness all along the cord. So now when we sew, since the foot is in position number 1, not a final seam, when you look at the finished piping, you're going to have a little bit of slack. That's what you want, because the final seam is going to come in where my thumbnail is and be a little closer to the cord, so that all of the stitching you've used before the final seam goes into the seam allowance. Almost done. Okay, there we are. That is what we have. Our next step is to attach this to the body. So here we have our sample, and these are the right sides facing up, so I'm going to put it on the front side, and I'm assuming a 5/8 inch seam. Now this is one of those fun little things that people don't really realize, but the seam gauge here, that distance is 5/8. So what you can do, let me just zoom in because you really want to see this. You want see, if you notice, you can see down here that the edge of the seam gauge is a little bit past the stitching. That's what you want, because the final seam is actually going to land at the edge of the seam gauge. So when you're basting your piping down, if you're assuming a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you can use that little edge to baste. And I tend to baste with a double thread. And especially on a curve, if you really want to tightly control where that piping falls, the best way really is to baste. These basting stitches will come out later, obviously, but for the time being, they're other end. Now what you can do in here to make this go around the curve a little more readily, you can make some clips about halfway in, and then see how nicely that opens up. So again, you check it as you're going around. Yep, still good. Because you're going to baste it first. You want to baste it down. Then our next step will be at the machine, which you'll see in just a moment. So I'm going to go off camera and finish this, and I'll bring it back in just a moment. Okay. All done. From here, we go over to the machine. Now at the machine, the foot is still in position number 1. I've changed threads so you can see how this works. We're still going to use a fairly long stitch for between 4 and 5 because we just want to tack this down. So again, when you're steering, you can put a little bit of pressure towards the right so that the foot will ride up against the fill in the piping. So this is position number 1. This is not the final seam. We're just nailing this down. So you can see here that the orange stitching and the green stitching are pretty much on top of each other because they're both foot in position number 1. Now from the reverse, you can see the green stitching. That is the stitching we just sewed. This is going to become important in the next step. So back to the work table. So now we have both sides of this sample. So we're going to put right sides together and pin. But notice I'm pinning them together right side up so that the green stitching is visible. That is very important in the next step, because if you can see the green stitching, you don't have to really do much except steer, because you know where your stitches are going to fall. Now you could hand baste this together, you could pin it. If it's fairly complex, you would want to baste it, but for something that's fairly straightforward like this, I'm going to pin. Now I'm going to talk about pinning for just a moment. Notice I pin parallel to the seam, not perpendicular. Debates rage, but I prefer this. I find it's a little easier to manage. From here, we go back to the sewing machine. Before we begin, you can see that I have adjusted the foot so that the needle is right at the edge of the foot. This is important for what we're going to be sewing. I've also changed the thread so you can see the net effect of what we're doing. By having the needle a little closer to the edge, it's going to be closer to the fill, and the green stitching is going to fall in the seam allowance. So we've shortened the stitch to a standard 2.5, and so now when we're sewing, you want to give it a little bit of a pull towards the right as you sew, and the foot will stop up against the rat tail And the blue stitching will be slightly to the left of the green stitching, which is what we want. So let me show you the result. There we are. See that? That is what we want. The green stitching is position number 1. The blue stitching is position number 2. So what happens? Usually when you're making piping, you end up seeing the stitching that you used to sew the piping closed. With this, since you've sewn the piping with the stitch a little further out, the final stitch will make it so that when you turn it right side out, you can pull it one way or the other, and you have a nice, snug, even thickness all along this seam, and you don't see any of the stitching. That may have been a little bit long for video, but understanding piping is essential for this particular pocket. So we're going to move ahead, and we want to cut our bias strips for this pocket, and these are 1.25 inches wide. Sorry. So we want enough for the pocket itself and for a buttonhole. So if you cut 3 strips that were, say, 8 inches long, you should be fine. So here we have our bias strips, and also we have the rat tail. We're using rat tail as opposed to the mouse tail. Rat tail is what makes this work. We are also, to refresh you, using the generic adjustable zipper foot. Now this particular foot, I'm very specific on this foot because this is 1/4 inch wide, and since the rat tail is 1/8 inch thick, what you want 2 times 1/8 inch is 1/4 inch, and it is the same width as the foot. That's what makes this work. So I'm very specific on this foot. Now I will go to the machine and sew the piping with the foot in position number 1. And I will bring them back here to show you the results. So here you can see long stitches, the foot in position number 1. The final stitching will fall closer to the rat tail fill. Now the red is on the bobbin on this, so we have our pipings made. Now let's talk about marking. This is a little illustration of what I'm going to be doing on the piece. So the end marks here are the length of the welt pocket. I'm going to make it 5 inches long. The black line here represents where the 2 pipings meet. That's all well and good, but what we have to do a little bit of favoring. So in order to get the 2 pipings to meet on the black line where you intend them, what you do is you measure up. It's just a scant 1/4 inch. It's 2 times 1/8 inch, which is the thickness of the piping. And so the red line here, when we put it on the machine, we're going to put the piping along the red line when we sew it down. That way, when everything turns right side out and lands, the 2 welts will meet exactly where you intend for them to meet. So, that said, let's go back to the fabric and I will show you how to mark. So here I have the marking for the pocket and the marking for the buttonhole. So once we have the main line, we want to come in and mark the guideline that we will use to sew down the first piping. So again, that is a scant 1/4 of an inch above the main line. Now, just something to talk about here. When you're marking, as you can see here, I'm marking with white chalk. This is a disappearing chalk. Whether it's disappearing or clay chalk that you brush away, when you're working on a white or a gray or a pastel, mark with white. If you use any of the colors, what you're going to run into is that you won't ever be able to get the entire colored chalk out. It will leave a stain and you'll have to have the thing dry cleaned. So really, use a white chalk. So now we have the marking. And so just to give you a reference here, that is how this will line up when we take it over to the machine to sew. Here I am with one piping for the pocket and another piping for the buttonhole, because they will both work very similarly and then change later. I've also, as you can see, I've put some fusible behind where the pocket lands and also behind where the buttonhole lands. Having a fusible is just going to make your life far easier. So now, let me just zoom in a little bit. Now the thing to know, the thing to just really notice here before I put the fabric under the foot, we have the needle is just inside the edge of the foot, ever so slightly inside the edge of the foot. You don't want it to extend out past the foot. That could cause you problems later. But this is the foot in position number 2, because what we will do when we're sewing these pipings down is we're going to sew everything with the foot in position number 2. So now I will slide this over, and what I want to do, leave yourself about 1.5 inches between the end mark and the end of the piping. So what you want to do is you want to bring the foot down so that this row of stitching starts right at the end of the cross mark. Now you're going to be sewing with extremely short stitches because the seam allowances here are about 1/8 of an inch all told. So we start 0.5 and we sew. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come out a little tiny bit, because you can see we're putting the piping right along that line, and we sew 0.5 for about 3/4 of an inch, and then we lengthen it to 0.75 to 1. You don't want it to be too long here, like I said. And so then we're just going to hold this piping down. Now, if you want to baste it, absolutely you could. I'm not averse to basting at all. I think it's a good thing. Okay, so about 3/4 of an inch from the end, we're going to shorten the stitch back to 0.5. And we stop it dead, right at the end. So this will be for the pocket. And next, I will show you the buttonhole. So as before, we position the piping against the guideline, and we're going to put the foot down, and we're going to put the needle down right there, right where the end of the buttonhole mark is, and we're going to sew with the 0.5 stitch all the way along. You want a short stitch there. This is a buttonhole. You don't want it to tear loose. And then we stop. So let me zoom out, show you the results here. So we have sewn down first the piping for the pocket and the piping for the buttonhole. Next we will go back to the work table. From here we will come in and trim the seam allowance down close, about 1/8 of an inch, you can see there. Okay, so there we've trimmed the seam allowance on the pocket from here to here, 1/8 of an inch. Same on the buttonhole. Okay, there we are. And so next, we want to, before we go to the machine, we want to trim the seam allowance on the other piping, whether it be for the pocket or the buttonhole, down to 1/8 of an inch. I know this seems counterintuitive, but this, when we go to the machine, you'll see it will make a lot more sense. So trimmed out the seam allowance on the piping, and we trim out the seam allowance on the buttonhole. So here we are. We have our pieces ready for the machine. We have the 2 pipings at hand, and we're going to put all of this under the foot. But before we put everything under the foot, we need to shift the position of the foot. So what we're going to be doing here is we're shifting. We want the needle to be in position number 2 on the opposite side of the foot. And you just want it ever so slightly inside the edge of that fold. So what's going to happen here? I'm going to sew the pocket first, and then I will sew the buttonhole. The seam allowance of the second piping is going to overlap the first. Now what I want to do here is bring this thread over, because we're going to be using this to figure out, okay, where do we start and end these rows of stitches. And having this thread makes it exceedingly easy for me to know. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to push, there we are, push everything together and the foot will drop down and it will push this piping to the proper distance. So the foot will actually ride on this piping because it's sewn down. And again, short stitches. Just make sure everything is in there. Yeah, there we are. Okay, put the needle in. So now, let me just get this started. And so then, I'm going to pull out just a tiny bit there. You can let this overlap just a little because it will find the distance. The foot is actually the spacer. So again, extremely short stitches, 0.5 to about 3/4 of an inch from the end, and then we just head down this row. Notice I keep pushing the two together because they will separate to the right distance. And that the foot is riding on the seam allowance on the right makes it so you have a parallel row of stitching. Now 3/4 of an inch from the end, we shorten the stitches back down and we use this as the spacing guide. Okay, so let me take this out of the machine. I'm going to turn around here. And so let's have a look at the reverse. Now you see this here, we overshot a little bit. That's not going to kill you. What we can do, and what I will do, and I overshot here. What you can do, it's very easy, is you just come in here and pick out a few stitches. I'm not going to waste your time on camera doing that, but you just pick out a few stitches to there. I'll do the same thing on the opposite side. So now we have the two pipings sewn together on the pocket. We can get rid of these now. We can come back over to the buttonhole and sew the buttonhole. So as we did before, we have a 0.5 stitch length. You want the stitches extremely short. And we nudge these two together. There we go. And again, push them, nudge them. And we stop at the end. So here we are. Let me trim the threads. There you have it. We'll go back to the work table because we have to do a little bit of adjusting before we go to the pressing table. So as I said, if you need to make these two rows of stitches match, you shorten the longer one. You pick out one or two stitches, and there you are. Whether it's on the buttonhole or on the pocket. I need to pull a couple stitches out of here. I'm just going to show you on one because I think you need to see it. Seems a little tedious, but okay. And this also is another reason you like having a little bit of fusible. There you go. Just one stitch. Next, we thin the ends of the pipings. Before we do the next step, we want the piping to be filled to the ends, but we don't want to catch the rat tail on the ends of the buttonhole or the pocket. So what I like to do is do what I call thinning the piping. Now, on something small, like a buttonhole, it's somewhat easy. What I will do is I will grab a hold of the rat tail, and you can give it a little bit of a tug, and you can feel. I'm going to zoom in. Now watch my fingernail. You can see, you can feel as that end passes, and you want the rat tail to be about a 1/16 of an inch in from the stitches. So it's quite easy to do this on one end of a piping. So you coax that like so. There we are. Okay. Now, the trick is the other end. The other end, you don't want to be tugging on this. You don't want to pull the rat tail out of the piping. That is not a good thing. So, what I like to do is come over here. I'm going to trim these down a little bit because it'll make it a little easier. And what we can do, because putting a pin here is going to keep us, if we have to tug, it's going to keep us from pulling this out. So you just want to come in and take out a few stitches, because the piping is sewn closed where we want it sewn closed. So we can open these little seam allowances and come in and there we are. So you can peel that back ever so slightly, give it a little bit of a tug. It's 3 o'clock, just so you know. And I will do the same thing to the other. I'm not going to make you watch this for the pocket, because it is kind of like watching paint dry. But I think it's just good to see how it works, because I would do this end on the pocket ends. So you just take this back, give it a little bit of a tug, because you want this to be a little bit too, it could be too short rather than too long. That's just the rule. So that is how we thin out the ends of our piping so that they don't thicken the ends of the opening when we sew it. I will work off camera to thin the ends on the pocket bag, or the pocket itself, and we will continue from there. Now we have the ends thinned on our pocket and on our buttonhole. The next lesson is going to be finishing the buttonhole. It's the quickest, so let's finish that first. We can come in here, we can trim these threads because we don't need them. They've done their job. And so now I'm going to cut just a very elongated X, starting here, heading here, heading here, heading here, heading here. I would draw it, but this is so narrow that the pen doesn't want to get in there. So this is where you want good scissors. Don't cheap out on your scissors. And so you're going to cut right to the end. You're not cutting the piping if you can help it. And again, notice how narrow those seam allowances are? That's why you want a short stitch. Otherwise this buttonhole as well as the pocket would tear loose the first time you used it. Okay, let's see if we, yep, okay. Now, let's go over to the pressing table and press. So here we are, and before we press, one thing I like to do is to trim these strips so that they are the same length. It's going to help you to line this up because you don't want to skew this when you're turning it right side out. So you want both of these strips to be pretty much the same length so you can line up the cut edges after you've turned everything right side out. Okay, so now this is how I think about it because we have it opened. So what we want to do is we want to fold and we match the folded edges and we lead through with the cut edges. So if you lead through with the cut edges, it turns. Ain't that a thing of beauty? And so I'm going to turn this over and do that again. So we and lead through, actually match the folded edges, lead through with the cut edges. I get a little confused sometimes. And so it's starting to look like a buttonhole. Now, I like to put this on the seam roll and make sure your cut edges, or the cut ends, of these pipings are matched up, and just a tiny little bit of whip stitching to base them closed. We base this closed, that's going to make it so much easier to manage. You can take these stitches out later, but right now they're going to help you get this to achieve perfection, which is what we want. And you can catch through the rat tail if you wish, or not. You just want this held together. So here we are at the end. And then trim the thread. And finally, we press. Now, is that beautiful? Almost finished. I'll meet you at the sewing machine so we can sew down the ends. We need to sew both ends down. So I have put the foot, as you can see, I put the foot in the position number 2, and I like to have it, the needle to the left. And so there's our buttonhole. So what we want to do here, there we are. That is where we're stitching. So just get all the thread back. So what you're going to do here is you're going to put your foot down on the 2 pipings, and you can give it a little bit of a squeeze inward, and then we sew it. Yeah, let me just have a look here. Oops, there we are. Ain't that beautiful? That little triangle, and you see how this triangle has just disappeared. That's why you want a long triangle. Now I'm going to flip this over and do a repeat performance here. So again, see, there's our triangle, and we're going to put it here, drop that foot right there. And give it a little bit of a squeeze. And again, the stitch length on this is 0.5. You want the shortest stitch you can get because you want this to be secure. Now let's pull out, turn this around. So here, I'm just going to trim that to 1/4 inch, as I will trim this to 1/4 inch. So there is our buttonhole. Isn't that gorgeous? Next, we're going to make the pocket. Before we go ahead to the pocket, I just wanted to show you the buttonhole in a light where you could see it. Okay, now, the pocket. This length here is 7 inches. And so I've worked ahead because there are a couple of pieces that we need for this pocket. We need a facing. This piece here, this will make it so that you don't see the lining fabric when the pocket is completed. That is the same length as the piping. So we're working with a 5-inch pocket, so we're using 7 inches. You want at least 1 inch on either end. This is about 3 1/4 to 3 1/2 inches. So then the pocket bag, same width as the facing, and it's 2 times the depth. Now I'm going for a fingertip pocket here. This is a pocket that I'm not really going to be using that much. So width is the same as the facing. Depth is twice your desired depth plus 1 inch. And so now we have the 2 pieces cut. Our next step is to pin these together and sew. So what I will do here, you just line these up. We're sewing it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you I'm pinning these 2 together, right sides together. But I will finish all of that and bring back the finished result. So here we have the facing sewn to the pocket bag. This is 1/2 inch seam allowance. As you can see, both seam allowances are pressed down towards the pocket bag. So now, how this is going to construct, to give you sort of a sense of how this is going to work, this will be behind here. And so then the pocket will come up like so. That is how the pocket will form. So this is the seam allowance that we're going to be putting down to here, right sides together. And so what you can do is center it on the piping. So now I'm going to pin, then I'll bring it in and show you a little closer kind of what we're doing here. So this, the cut edge is roughly 1/2 inch from that piping. That's going to give you a little bit of a seam allowance. And so while we're looking at the top piping for placement of the pocket bag, we're going to turn this over and we're going to look at the lower stitching line to sew the bag in place. Now I will go get a pen and I'll mark that to show you where we will be stitching. So you can see I'm marking the lower stitching line. Now you don't have to mark it, I'm just marking it for clarity because I think it's helpful. So here, again, cut edge 1/2 inch from the piping. We're going to sew on the lower stitching line. So we will go to the machine and do just that. Now we're ready to put this work under the foot. So you can see, sorry about that, I have put the foot in position number 2, and then we're going to slide all of this in, and we're going to use that thread to know exactly where to start this stitching. Right there. We will sew it again like we did before, short stitches, slightly longer, short. As you can see, the foot sits between the two pipings. You can see there's the ridge of the piping. The foot rides along. So while you need to be careful, you want to make sure that everything sews correctly. It's not as crucial as the first row of stitching. So then now, what we're going to do here is stop right on the second row, or the second thread. So here we are. We have the second row of stitching. Turn this over. We can take out our pins. And just turn this back here. And we can trim these away. They've done their job. Next, we go to the pressing table to open this up and turn. As we did before, we want to open up this. We don't want to cut through the pipings, we just want to cut through the ground fabric. And again, we want long triangles. So I just find it a little easier to start at the middle and work towards the ends. And then there. Yeah. Come in here. And as we did before, you're going to cut right to the ends of those seams. And if you remember from the buttonhole, that little triangle is going to turn to lint very quickly. So that's why you want a long one, so that you have a little more of a chance of catching it in the end when you stitch. There we are. Now, from the front, you want to turn all of this through the opening. And again, match the folded edges and bring them, lead with the cut edges. Oh, there we are. Not bad. And same here. Folded edges, cut edges. Match the folded edge and lead through with the cut edges. There we are, starting to look like a pocket. So our next step then is putting it on the sleeve board and basting. So like we did on the buttonhole, we just have needle and thread. We're going to whip stitch that to hold it closed. So what you can do here, zoom this in a little bit. What you want to look at here is make sure that these two rows of stitching are ending at the same place. That way you won't skew your opening. Everything will remain square. So then you just whip stitch this closed. It's 330. And by whip stitching this closed, it's going to make it so much easier to control. Now, a note on basting thread. Notice this is fairly fine. With basting thread, you don't necessarily want to go with the thickest thing you can get your hands on. Sometimes this fabric, it wouldn't leave a mark, but if you were working on something like a gabardine or a satin, if you basted with rayon machine embroidery thread, you would be less likely to leave basting marks when you press, which is a heartbreak if you've ever done it, because they're almost impossible to get out. So fine rayon machine embroidery thread, if you can get your hands on it, doesn't hurt to have some in your sewing kit. Okay, so we have this basted. Now let's press. Okay, I think we're looking good. So let's turn it over and see what we have made. Again, 330. So there we are. We have everything except the ends sewn down. So we will go back to the machine and sew the ends. Like we sewed the ends of the buttonhole, we want to do the same thing here. That you can sort of coax between. And the stitch length is a 0.5 stitch. You want this short. And you can scooch these together just a tiny bit. And you just sew that end. Show the result. Sew the end. Makes a nice square end. And again, we will repeat that operation on the other side. Voila. And the other end. Is that not beautiful? Now, I will go back over to the work table so we can finish this pocket. Now we want to sew the pocket bag. We will bring this up, and I like to have, and bring this up, let me just turn it over here. First, it doesn't hurt to pin a couple places just to hold it steady. And I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to fold back along the piped edge. Now, what you want to do is you want to have that stitching line about a 1/2 inch from this cut edge all the way along. So what we will do is we're going to be sewing again on that stitching line, but we can't really pin on our seam allowance because it's not that wide. So we're going to go over to the machine, and we're going to start here and stitch down and finish there. Off to the machine. It may seem counterintuitive, but you can see we're not using the zipper foot right now. This is too narrow for the zipper foot to actually stay put, so it's much easier to sew this with a regular presser foot. So I'm going to put the needle in right at the beginning of that row of stitches. And we can just sew with the standard 2.5 stitch on this. We don't have to go too short here. And you want to be as close to that row of stitching as possible. If you need to err on the side of a little bit to the right rather than to the left. But having just a regular presser foot is going to make this sew much more easily. So now we finish. Let me show you. So we started right there and we sewed all along and finished there. Next, the pressing table. So here is the pipe pocket from the front. First thing we want to do is remove these pins. They have done their job. So now we want to construct a pocket bag. So when I flip this up, normally you would just press a crease and sew all the way around. And you would be correct. However, on these particular pockets, especially if you plan on using them, you want to shorten the back of the pocket in relation to the front. So this is an old bespoke trick that I learned years ago. What you want to do is pick up about 1/2 inch pleat and press. Then from here, you're going to pin everything together for sewing. Sorry. Oopsie. Cameraman and teacher all in one. Sorry about that. Okay. So we will go to the sewing machine. And we're going to start here and sew all the way around to here. One operation. So at the machine, we have the zipper foot on again. It just makes it easier to sew this pocket. I like to get this stitch as close to the end of the opening as I can. And this is just a standard 2.5 stitch. And if you really want to mark the stitching line, you can. But I don't. Now when you're sewing this, notice I'm sewing a curve on the corner. It's better to have a curve rather than a corner because curves don't catch lint. Okay, so let's have a look. So you can see we've sewn the pocket bag with our pleat. Now just a little, one more note on the pleat. It's 4:30. You have the leading edge of the pleat facing down, which means that you're not going to catch any schmutz on the inside. So let's go back to the work table and finish this pocket. To finish the pocket, it's a simple matter of using your pinked rotary cutter blade or pinking shears and trimming. There's one side and the other. Trim our threads that way too. So let me show you from the back. So there is our pocket. And let's just revel in the beauty of this pocket for just a moment. Now, not to be forgotten, we have to finish the bound buttonhole. That's next. So for the bound buttonhole, what I have done is I've created a mock facing, because on a garment you're going to have a facing that the buttonhole has to finish to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin a couple places here to hold that facing in position. Now when you're making your buttonholes, make the buttonholes, install your facing, and then finally make the openings that we're about to learn. So here, turn this over. Push that up for a minute. So the buttonhole is roughly in this area here. So what you want to do is you want to center a square of silk organza. This is about 3 inches by 3 inches. You can vary that because you could trim it down later if you need to. So what you want to do is you want to pin it to just the facing. You can take the pins out on the front in a moment. So you have this on the right side of the facing. Now we're going to turn this back over and we are going to put pins through right at the ends of the buttonhole. Now, turn this over and get the pen, and we want to mark dots where the pins come through the organza. Now those pins have done their job. We can take them away. And we can unpin the facing from the other side and open this out flat. From here, you want to draw a couple of lines, and these lines are about 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 apart. You want these fairly close together. They're parallel. And then round out the ends. And this represents the stitching line. Because what we're doing is we're making a faced opening for this. Our next stop is the machine. This is what's called a darning foot. What we are going to be sewing is what's called a free motion stitch. And so the darning foot holds the fabric in place. That in connection with dropping the feed, what you're going to do is you're going to move this just with your fingers. So the feed is not going to move, you're moving it with your fingers. When you're moving, you want it to move slowly so you have a short stitch. Notice I'm starting in the middle. It's easier to start in the middle than try to start on one of the ends. So this is what it's going to look like. Voila. That's the stitch. Our next stop is the pressing table. Before we press, we clip it. Clip it to the stitching there and here. And then we turn it over, clip it the other way. Now, before we press this, we'll turn it and press it open, it's good to just give it one last press. And then we're going to take this organza and pull everything through to the back. So we're creating a faced opening. That's really what we're creating. Now when we press, again, as you can see, I do like pressing on a sleeve board and a seam roll. You want to try to favor it so that the organza falls inside. You like the organza better because it is thin. It won't create bulk inside the garment. And like I said, it creates the faced opening. And if you color match the organza to your fabric, you won't really see it. Now, if you're worried about all of this hanging out inside, you can trim it down if you wish. So when we turn it right side out, if I hadn't used the orange thread, you really wouldn't see it. So when we, there we are. This is where it's going. So what we will do is center that on the back of the buttonhole. So I will take it over to the work table and sew that in by hand. So you sew this with a slip stitch. I'm just finishing up here. I worked ahead a little bit. And the beauty of this is, for this one, the buttonhole looks pretty much the same from both sides. Okay, so let me secure the thread here. Bury the end of the thread between the layers. Pull slightly, trim the thread. There we are. Now, that looks pretty darn good. If I had used matching thread, you wouldn't see that or that. So it looks like a piped buttonhole from that side and from this side. And I've opened this up, as you can see. So if you want to put a button through there, you can. So let's just look at both of our tasks today and feel a sense of accomplishment. We have installed the piped pocket, and we've installed the piped buttonhole. So there's your lesson. Hope you enjoyed it.